Welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Karin England. I am a landscape architect and park planner with Metro Vancouver Regional Parks, and I'm your host today for this half-hour Facebook Live session, which is part 4 of an ongoing series on garden topics. After each broadcast, the videos are posted to our Facebook page, so you can catch up with ones you may have missed, or if you can't watch the whole episode today, you can watch it at your convenience. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge that the land that we live on is the shared ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish First Nations. I would like to express my personal gratitude for the example set by Indigenous people for how to live with a deep connection to nature. Part of my work at Metro Vancouver has been to collaborate with the UBC Botanical Garden on a free tool that supports people who want to garden in a more sustainable way. And I would like to show you that tool.
You gotta be quiet. I'm inside now.
This is the Growgreen Guide website. You can find it at growgreenguide.ca. You can see that it's got several resources for you. It has designs which have been developed in collaboration with the UBC Botanical Garden. So you know that the information that's being provided to you is locally appropriate and trustworthy. So there's designs, there's information about plants that we recommend for growing in this region, and there are resources. So you can see we've got green thumb news, some garden vocabulary, and gardening tips, including some blog posts on hot gardening topics. We also encourage you to join our mailing list so you can get news from and updates from the Growgreen Guide team. So I encourage you to go take a look at that website. It's a fantastic free resource suitable for people who are gardening in our region. So today we are talking about trees, and our guest speaker is none other than Douglas Justice, the Associate Director of Horticulture and Collections at the UBC Botanical Garden. He is a writer, a speaker, and an inspirational teacher, beloved by students everywhere. Welcome, Douglas.
Hi, Karin. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Maybe we could start off. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got started in horticulture and why you're so passionate about horticulture.
Right. Well, horticulture is all around us. Plants are all around us. My dad is a landscape architect, and my mother grew up in the mountains of Northern California. And so when I grew up, it seemed quite natural for people to know about plants and to talk about plants. And so it seemed like just a very natural thing to do, both as a career and as a passion.
So I heard you say once that you grew up thinking it was the most natural thing in the world to be passionate about plants, because that's kind of the milieu that you grew up in. That's what what people did in your family.
Exactly. And my grandmother had a huge garden on a farm, and I remember spending a lot of time with her and in her greenhouse. And so it was kind of all around. I couldn't really escape it, I think.
Trees in particular are a passion of yours. I was wondering if you could tell us some of the ecological benefits that trees provide for all of us.
Well, sure, of course. The great thing about trees is, the sort of the number one thing is their permanence. And that's a really important thing in a world where, we throw things away and things are, change from 1 week to the next or 1 year to the next. But trees are there, and so there are all kinds of things that rely on trees, like birds, for example, and even the pests that are in the trees are valuable because the birds then have something to eat in those trees. And then, of course, trees also provide a considerable amount of cleaning. Dirty air is filtered by trees. Trees produce oxygen, and they sequester carbon in the by drawing in carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. There are, and there are so many things about trees that are more difficult, less tangible to describe. And the thing I think that most people would understand is that trees are beautiful. At least most trees are beautiful, and that I think makes us all feel happy when we have trees.
Right. There's been lots of studies about having even just visual access to nature, even being able to look at trees confers health benefits. There's a study that was done in the States, quite a while ago now, that people who even had a photograph of a tree in their hospital recovery room recovered faster than those that didn't. So I think they're beautiful, and that humans are wired to be biophilic by nature. We love nature, and it nourishes us in some ways.
Yeah, and the older the tree, generally, the more awe-inspiring, or it's sort of the more reverence that we have for those trees. And so there's nothing wrong with planting young trees. I do it all the time, but when you see really magnificent old trees, that's something that I think people feel right deep down in their guts, that this is really a good thing.
Right. That being said, like, it's a big decision then, what tree you're going to plant. What are some of the considerations when you're looking for a tree to plant? What do you need to consider?
Right. Well, the first thing that anybody needs to consider when planting a tree is that a tree is an investment, and that it's not going to be easy to move, or um, if it's well placed and it's the right sort of tree, it's going to provide all those benefits that we talked about, and those benefits are going to accrue over time. So what we have is we have the potential for something that's really going to improve, increase property values, improve your well-being, improve biodiversity in the neighborhood, whatever. On the other hand, poorly chosen, poorly planted, that this is going to be detrimental, and ultimately, you're going to have to pay money to have something removed, or it's going to be an eyesore, or something like that. And so it really does require a considerable amount of sort of critical analysis before you plant it. Like I said before, planting the tree is the easiest part. Actually determining what kind of tree is appropriate is the thing that really deserves the time and consideration.
So how do you go about picking a tree? What are some of the things you might think about?
Right. And so there are two things that I always tell people. One is that you should look around and see what you see that's pleasing. So if you're in a new neighborhood and you see somebody has a really nice looking tree, you can always ask that person. The second is to go to parks and gardens. And unfortunately, right now, we have a little bit of a problem. Not all of our gardens are actually open for viewing, but when they do, the great thing about botanical gardens in particular is that you can look at trees and they are labeled. And that means that you can actually get the right name. That's not to say that you can't find labeled trees in nurseries and garden centers. Those often are very good places for helping to decide on trees. But you have to really be careful that once you walk into a nursery and you have this in your idea that you want to buy a tree, somebody's going to sell you a tree, and it may not be exactly the tree that's the right tree. And so, like I say, it's better to go somewhere where you don't have that pressure, the sales pressure, and just walk around and take a look at trees that are planted in the landscape, and find out what they are.
I happen to know that you have worked on a tree app called Vancouver Trees that provides all kinds of information about the trees that are possible to grow in our region, and um, the kinds of growing conditions they need, their ultimate size, what kind of application they serve best in. And I would encourage people to take a look on the UBC Botanical Garden website to find out how to access that app. Did you want to talk about the app just for a second?
Well, only to say that you should know about it because you were instrumental in helping us put it together. Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
It is, I think, it's a good resource for this area. That, one of the things that I also try and tell students is that there isn't really a lot of really sort of site-specific information, for Vancouver on trees. Very, very few books have been written on trees, and if you look on the internet, the overwhelming majority of sites are for somewhere else. And so this was actually the Vancouver Trees app was really the result of students asking me, where do I get this information about, what can we do in Vancouver? And so that's what I would say about that.
That's a nice tie back to the Growgreen guide, because the information that we're providing on there is particularly for this region.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really, we do have a very, very different kind of an environment than, say, Eastern North America or even England, which is probably the closest climate equivalent that we have. But there are so many things that are different about rainfall patterns and the wind patterns and heat, and of course the availability of different kinds of plants are quite different here than they are in southern England. So yeah,
we've got a question
sure
from someone on Facebook asking what kinds of trees, particularly food producing trees, you would recommend for growing on a container on a patio.
Right. So that I almost always preface any comments about food producing trees with a warning, and that is that food producing trees are a lot more work than a lot of people anticipate, and so you have to really be committed. And so if you are committed, that's great, and I think you can get a lot of pleasure and potentially a lot of food out of those kinds of plants. In terms of containers, the bigger the container, the better. Small containers are problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that if we get a cold winter, the frost can penetrate easily, and even hardy trees can be damaged in small pots. The other thing is that we have fairly significant summer drought in the Vancouver area, and that means that even a day or two away from the watering can or the hose can mean that a plant in a small container can dry out, and that can basically mean the end of fruit production for that year. And so when we're growing plants for fruit, we have to be extremely careful about maintaining enough moisture at the roots and maintaining humidity, or not necessarily humidity, but maintaining conditions so that they don't fluctuate wildly. And so again, the bigger the container, the better. And so what I would suggest if you're looking for plants for containers is apples. There are apples on dwarfing rootstocks, and nurseries will be able to help you with this. What you want is a dwarfing rootstock. A semi-dwarfing rootstock the tree may not be small enough. But that's the great thing about apples, that there's so many different kinds of apples that are available, and they're also available on a variety of different rootstocks, and those rootstocks confer size control over the tops. So
the fruit stays the same size.
Oh, of course, yes, yeah, absolutely. But the tree is smaller. So apples and pears are very, very good. And when they're small like that, you can kind of take care, they're much easier to take care of. You want to stay away from plants that are disease prone. And while apples are disease prone, again, a small apple tree is much easier to take care of. Things like cherry trees are problematic. They're very, very susceptible to fungus disease and a bacterial disease that can be devastating. Apricots, again, plums and peaches, they're all members of the same group, and they don't really do well in containers. They really need kind of drier atmosphere and much more root room, for one thing. There are some other things that you could try. Figs, as long as the container is very, very large. Fig roots will freeze, and that can be a problem. Persimmon, again, similarly, we can do a lot of damage to a persimmon in a container. But boy, what a beautiful, beautiful tree, laden with orange fruit, just kind of dripping off it in the fall. There are other food producing trees that are not necessarily like fruits, although technically, I guess nuts are fruits. So you could grow hazelnuts, for example, or I wouldn't try walnuts in a container because the walnuts are much too big. But there are a few other things that are you could potentially try.
I get lots of emails from nurseries offering to sell me citrus trees that you can put in pots.
Yeah, and that's great. And so what you want to do with a citrus, you have to do a couple of things. One is most citrus, when you grow them hard, that is, you grow them in a container, and that's a little bit hard on a plant. They tend to produce thorns. And so what you need is there's a tool, which is, I can't remember what it's called. It looks like a pair of pliers, but it has a kind of blunt nose, and they're sharp, and they come together like this. And you need to be able to chop off those thorns, because let me tell you, they are very, very strong thorns, and they can do a lot of damage. But citrus need heat. They're really, if you look at the citrus growing areas of the world, sort of Arizona and Florida, and it's Southern California, it's warm. And unless you can provide like seriously warm conditions, you're not going to get much in the way of fruit. Now, there are some lemons. I know people on Salt Spring Island that can grow lemons, but it's a bit of a struggle, and it doesn't always work. Some years is better than others. Now, I would say that one of the joys of growing citrus is the smell of the flowers. And so I'm one of those people who, like, if it's got flowers, I don't care if it's got fruit. It's just, because the scent of orange blossom or lemon blossom is just a joyous smell.
It's probably my favorite smelling flower of any plant.
Yeah. If I can just quickly finish with citrus, the other problem with citrus is that they're very buggy. You're not going to find much in the way of disease with citrus, but citrus are very, very attractive to a number of insect pests, including scale, and that's very, very hard to dislodge. That is, it's difficult, particularly if you're trying to do things in a natural way, using biological pest controls or whatever. It's a little bit difficult. Once the pests become established on citrus, it's very, very hard. And most people that grow citrus, what they will do is they will bring the plant into the garage or into the house for the winter to protect it. And that's when a lot of those pests can proliferate. And so that's a problem. So you have to be, aware that there are certain things that you have to, you'd have to do your research, and you got to make sure you know what you're in for. And citrus like heavy soil, and they want to be in a big pot, and that makes it much, much harder to move unless you have a forklift at the ready. It might be just too much to be able to move it around.
We have another question.
Sure.
Someone is looking for the best tree to put in a small backyard that's shady. They're hoping they could use planted dogwood, but If not a dogwood, then what would you recommend?
Well, I
Small
think
shady backyard.
yeah, dogwood's actually a really good choice for a small shady backyard. There's a cultivar called Eddie's White Wonder, which is uh, which is a pretty good tree. It's a sort of stand-in for the Pacific dogwood, which is our native dogwood. And and I only mention that because dogwood is so hard to find. If you can find it, it's it's at least as good as the Eddie's White Wonder in that kind of a situation. The thing about Eddie's White Wonder is it tends to be a little bit lanky, and so particularly in the shade, it's going to be very open and it's have a lot of space between the branches. So I would say dogwood. If you have lots of space, something like a Davidia is a beautiful tree in the shade.
Mm.
Um, and even the Chinese tupelo, Nyssa sinensis, is a really wonderful tree and tolerates quite a bit of shade.
What about Cornus Cusa? Would you recommend that over the Eddie's White Wonder?
Oh, the great thing about Cornus Cusa is that it's much more disease resistant. That is, the leaves are always clean. But in terms of shade, what it does is it won't so much go up as go sideways. Cornus Cusa is a very broad spreading tree, and even in the open, it's going to be kind of ultimately teardrop shaped. But in the shade, the branches will sort of migrate horizontally for meters and meters. That might be okay, but a lot of people typically don't have that much lateral space. So,
Right.
yeah.
So it does kind of a similar thing to vine maple growing in shade, like the native vine maple.
Yeah. That's actually a very good suggestion. Vine maple. There are a number of maples that'll tolerate shade. Vine maple is one of the best, and one of the real advantages of vine maple is that it's a native plant, which means that it actually is adapted to our summer drought regime. And so once it's established, it can tolerate much greater or more lengthier droughts than, say, Japanese maple, which is similarly shade tolerant, but suffers in Vancouver if it's not watered. Once it's established, it still needs to be watered.
Right. Another follow-on question from Dogwood, and then we've got someone who's growing mangoes. But let's start with the Dogwood question.
Yeah.
Are all the dogwood fruits edible? Now, I know that you will walk around the garden and eat all kinds of things that look like they're inedible off plants. Are dogwood fruits edible?
Yeah, let me start by saying, first of all, don't do what I do. Do what I say, which is don't just stick things in your mouth. You can get into a lot of trouble that way. But Pacific dogwood produces a dry fruit. It's not like Cornus Cusa, the Korean dogwood or the Japanese dogwood, produces a fruit that's fleshy and it's quite edible. I wouldn't call it anything more than, say, famine food, but it's edible. Whereas the Pacific dogwood, the fruits dry up very, very quickly, and they're not really edible at all. And Eddie's White Wonder doesn't produce any fruit. It's a hybrid that's sterile.
Right. So it's case specific. Nicole's going to have to do her research before she.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone is growing mangoes indoors from seed.
Yeah, wow.
I never thought to do that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. The hardest part of that is probably cleaning the seed. But I don't know if this person has ever been to the tropics and seen mangoes, but a mango is an enormous tree. It is a magnificent tree, but it is enormous. And I'll tell you, unless you have a very large house, this is not going to work out for you.
Oh.
And so once it gets to a certain point, there's not really much you can do about it. We get the occasional request from somebody. I have an avocado or I have a mango. Is there somewhere, can I donate it to you? Is there somewhere you can put it? And there really isn't anywhere. Like, if you know the Bloedel Conservatory, and most of us know the Bloedel Conservatory, and if you've been in there, you see there are lots of really interesting trees in there and lots of tropical trees. If they had a mango in there, if it was a 40-year-old mango, it would fill the entire dome.
Oh.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a fun experiment for a short while.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Someone else has got a question about a tree they could put in the front of their house where it's dry and they get exposure to noise and traffic. They don't say if it's sunny or not. It just says that it's dry.
Well, if it's dry, I'm going to guess that it's probably like a southern or a western exposure. And there are lots of trees that actually would tolerate this. And if you're looking for something that's going to block sound, I'm afraid, there's a lot of misinformation out there that says that, foliage stops sound. It doesn't really. What it does is it draws your eye away from the source of the sound, and that makes you not notice the sound as much. But in any case, plants that are in the oak family, things like beeches and oaks, often do very, very well in those kinds of situations. And there are a few plants in the birch family, so things like the hornbeam, and hornbeams like a dry environment, but they need moisture at depth. And so you have to kind of solve that one. I don't know. They don't need that much moisture. If anybody's familiar with, say, First Avenue between Clark Drive and Commercial Drive, there's that street has European hornbeam up both sides, and they've been there for about 40 years, and they're truck pruned. You can see the outline of where the trucks are. Nobody ever waters those, and they're healthy. There's no problem with those. So once they're established, then their roots are going down to fine moisture. So when our correspondent says that it's dry, is it really dry? Is it really dry at depth? And these are things that you can only find out by digging a hole. My family home, where my dad still lives in South Vancouver, the next door they dug up the whole backyard and front yard because the basement flooded, because they were looking for the source of the water that was getting into the basement, and they discovered an underground stream, and basically the underground stream is going under the house next door. And so it was an incredible job to fix this. But we always wondered why things did so well in the next door neighbor's yard. And that's because the trees that were planted were finding that source of water. And so you never know what's going on down below until you dig a hole.
That leads to a question for me about climate change in the future, and what how tree species that we're growing now will react. Will some of them do better, and will some of them do worse?
Yeah, and that's, it's a fascinating subject, and it's one that I'm very much interested in, because I'm in the business of recommending trees to students who are going to go into careers that hopefully are going to span 40 or 50 years. And so what I was recommending 20 years ago is not, these are not the trees that I'm recommending now. And it's actually a fairly easy thing to work out for yourself. And if you look at the trees that are being recommended in Seattle, those are the trees that we should be recommending in the next few years. If you look at the trees that are being recommended in, say, Central California, those are the trees that we should be recommending in probably 10 or 15 years. And so we can see that plants that are woodland trees, things that are not really heat tolerant, things like styrax or Stewartia, or many of the maples, or in fact, dogwoods, those are all woodland kinds of trees, and they really appreciate a bit of shade, cool roots, and water at depth in the summer. Those are great plants for here, for now, and as long as we can maintain some cover and maintain some moisture in the soil, they'll do fine. But to plant them out in the open is a mistake, because they're not going to perform as well in 10 years as they do now. And so what I would recommend is things like plants in the oak family that are much better adapted to heat and water stress conditions. The oak family and the oaks in particular are really good choices. Now, right now we have probably close to 35% of the trees on the streets in Vancouver are not going to do very well. There's a huge number of maples that are probably going to be, we're going to lose those to water stress. And we should be thinking about replacing those with oaks and plants that are much more water, more resilient in drought conditions.
Okay, one last question before we wrap up, I think. Someone is asking, could we suggest a tree that they could line their fence with for privacy, that they could make a sort of bleached topiary along the edge that is evergreen or 8B? Put evergreen. It in your Rolodex of your brain there.
Yeah, evergreen and 8B. Well, so when somebody said pleaching, then they obviously know what pleaching is, but I bet most people don't know what pleaching is. Pleaching is really just the training of plants into shapes, into arches and ladders and all those kinds of things. And the classic plant that's used for pleaching is the hornbeam, the European hornbeam, and it's really flexible and it's very easy to use. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the other part of my brain is trying to find an evergreen that can do the same thing. And there are really not very many evergreens that are as versatile as that, but there are a couple. And I would say, for example, no, something just came into my brain and then left. Maybe Karin, you can make a suggestion.
This could be completely wrong. I'm just going to throw it out there. Sure. Could you do it with an evergreen magnolia, zone 8B?
Yeah, the problem with evergreen magnolias is that they're too brittle. And
so snap.
What you need is you need that kind of flexibility in the stems. Now there's a shrubby Magnolia leavifolia, which has small leaves and quite flexible branches, and I wouldn't call it particularly brittle. And I've seen it used as for a hedge. But if you're looking for screening at any height, that's going to be the problem. It's going to be very, very difficult to get something, that's tall enough to screen, that's also evergreen and that's also flexible. So
I've seen those Cedrus atlanticas. I think there's one at the Vancouver Botanical Garden that are trained that way, but they don't have enough dense foliage to be any kind of screen.
That's right, and the reason that works is because those branches are far apart. If they were closer together, then you'd tend to get leaf drop, leaf diseases that make a mess.
So, Lucian, I think you might have stumped us temporarily. You might have to think about it and get back to it. Have you got something? We can think about it and get back to it.
Yeah. I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Okay, think about it. Yeah. Okay, it's probably time for us to start wrapping up.
Okay.
I wanted to let people know that Douglas has provided an article on our blog at growgreenguide.ca called Why Plant Trees. And he gives some more advice in addition to what he shared today. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, Douglas. It's always a treat to talk to you, and you've got so much information to share. It's wonderful that you could join us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Karin. I appreciate it.
And for those questions we didn't get to, we'll follow up with written responses as soon as we can. Probably not instantaneously, but usually within a day or two, we'll have responses up on Facebook. And we welcome you to join us again next week on Wednesday, June 17th at 12:30. In anticipation of National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, we are having an Aboriginal herbalist and educator named Laurie Snyder join us to talk about native plant gardening. And until next week, I wish you the very best of happy gardening.